After 4 full days of lying in state, the coffin of Queen Elizabeth left Westminster Hall at 10:44 for the short journey to Westminster Abbey for a state funeral. At the Abbey, dozens of world leaders had gathered, abandoning their diaries. President Macron amongst them. President Biden given dispensation to use his bomb-proof car. But inside the Abbey, Commonwealth leaders and royalty took precedence. In the bottom of the picture, you see the US president ushered further and further back to row 14. Former prime ministers together again, as they were for the Accession Council, proclaiming Charles King just over a week ago. Amongst the last to arrive at the Abbey, 2 of the Queen's great-grandchildren. Prince George, now second in line to the throne. Outside Parliament, the coffin on the state gun carriage, last used at the state funeral of Winston Churchill in 1965, pulled by tradition by naval ratings. "40 march behind to act as brakes. The Queen's children, and behind them her grandchildren, lined up to walk behind the coffin. The coffin arrived at the Abbey for a funeral decades in the planning. With the Buckingham Palace card, now the residence of the King, it read, "In loving and devoted memory." The hymns and the readings were all in line with the Queen's wishes. Liz Truss, who she appointed as Prime Minister 2 days before her death, read the second lesson.
Lord, show us the Father, and it sufficeth us. Jesus saith unto him, Have I been so long time with you, and yet hast thou not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. Thanks be to God.
The Archbishop of Canterbury gave a short sermon, contrasting the Queen's lifelong service with some people, not named, who cling to power.
Few leaders receive the outpouring of love that we have seen. People of loving service are rare in any walk of life. Leaders of loving service are still rarer. But in all cases, those who serve will be loved and remembered when those who cling to power and privileges are long forgotten. The grief of this day, felt not only by the late Queen's family, but all round the nation, the Commonwealth and the world, arises from her abundant life and loving service, now gone from us.
Trumpets announced a 2-minute silence. The cameras picked out former prime ministers and cabinet ministers. And amongst the European monarchs in the prime seats, behind the candle, Spain's disgraced former king, Juan Carlos. After the national anthem, a lament from a lone piper. The coffin was then carried out and placed back on the state gun carriage. It was pulled from Westminster Abbey to the Wellington Arch at Hyde Park Corner. Prince George and Princess Charlotte looked on from a car behind. Applause broke out all the way along the route. Then, past the Albert Memorial, the journey to Windsor in the state hearse. Some of London's busiest routes closed, lined with people, throwing flowers, cheering, taking photos. And then through more blocked-off roads until the hearse, now peppered with flowers, was joined by an escort of guards for the long walk to the castle, watched by thousands. At the bottom of the screen, you can see a horse's tail catch an RAF bandsman in the face. One brief, unscripted moment in a day of clockwork ceremonial. Inside the walls of the castle, the Queen's corgis. And again, arranged for a final march behind their mother and grandmother, the 4 children and grandsons. And for the Grenadier Guardsmen who've been pallbearers at Westminster Hall, Westminster Abbey, now their most challenging ordeal, ascending into St George's Chapel. The orb and sceptre, fastened to the coffin since the lying in state, were now removed and placed on the altar, along with the imperial state crown. And in a final ceremonial act, the Lord Chamberlain, Lord Parker, former head of MI5, broke his wand of office and placed it on the Queen's coffin. Then, as a psalm was read, the coffin descended to its final resting place in the royal family vault of St George's Chapel.
In the name of Jesus Christ, who suffered for thee, in the name of the Holy Spirit, who strengtheneth thee, in communion with the blessed saints, and aided by angels and archangels, and all the armies of the heavenly host, may thy portion this day be in peace.
After the piper's lament, the first verse of God Save the King. The King's emotion on show in a way the Queen's never was. The a period of mourning drawing to a close, and with it, an era. We talk about the decades of planning that went into today. It's decades of intensive, regular, high-level planning, and that's not just because people in Whitehall and in the palaces wanted to make sure that the country coped with this moment. It's also because ceremonial, ambitious ceremonial, and getting it right is part of Britain's global brand. And I think there's a feeling in the palace and in Whitehall today that that brand has been honoured and that things have gone pretty well, not just in terms of today's ceremonial, but in the build-up to it, estimating how many crowds we want to see the lying in state, and also trying to balance the sadness of the population, those people who felt a very strong affection for the Queen, with some positivity and some feeling of pride. And I think they're walking away tonight feeling that they have pulled that off. We cannot ignore what we've been talking about throughout this entire period of mourning, the fact that it comes at a point of economic crisis for many households. And just as a new Prime Minister came to office, you got a flavour of how difficult that is for Liz Truss, barely known internationally, it seems. Some Australian commentators who were doing live commentary on the state funeral didn't identify her as she walked into the palace and thought she might be a minor royal or local dignitary. But what Liz Truss is going to be doing now is bursting with announcements, and you're going to see those in the second half of this week. But the question that this leaves you with, looking at all those leaders who came to Westminster Abbey today, interrupting their schedules to be there, looking at the number of people who are watching these events across the world, the question that keeps coming back to you is how much is this unique to this very special, long-reigning monarch? The Queen will have hoped that she will have fed capital into not just the constitutional monarchy, but into the country, which can be deployed in years to come. But we are now at the moment, after the aura of her mourning and the ceremonial attached to it, we are now beginning the era when we find out just whether we are diminished, whether our reach takes a dip without Queen Elizabeth.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Well, as you've just seen, people gathered in their thousands along the route to Windsor Castle to watch the Queen's journey to her final resting place, along the long walk lined with chestnut trees and up the west steps of St George's Chapel, the crowd falling silent as the procession went past. Former Prime Ministers joined members of the royal family and the Queen's personal staff at the committal service in St George's Chapel, while this evening the royal family are holding a far more private burial service. Our correspondent Andy Davis is with me, and this one is off camera.
It is a moment behind the castle walls here that none of us will see. It's expected to take place within the next 20 minutes or so, and it'll happen in a very small chapel just to the side of the choir where we saw the royal family gathered for the committal service this afternoon. It's in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, and what we understand will happen is that the King and members of his family will gather there. The King will scatter earth on the coffin of his mother, whereupon the coffin will be interred beside the remains of her husband, Prince Philip, her parents, and the ashes of her sister Margaret. It will be a final private ceremony for a family who, ever since the day the Queen died, have been immersed in this extraordinary series of ceremonial rituals and public duties which culminated in today's very moving committal service. And this is a service like the one in Westminster Abbey today, which has been followed intently by many people throughout Windsor. You know, you walk past the pubs and there are people sitting in there today in silence watching this unfold. And by the long walk, there were thousands today who'd gone there to watch that final, remarkable procession. This is how the day went here in Windsor. Even a town steeped in a history of royal moments must have wondered at this one. Thousands made their way in this morning, one day perhaps to tell others, I was there.
Where do you come from?
Oxford.
From up near Hull?
East Anglia.
Warminster. But I used to be stationed here in Windsor as a guardsman and for 30 years as a fireman, believe it or not. So doing the right thing, bringing the family up to say goodbye to a great monarch.
It's very upsetting. I'm struggling to not cry now, so it's going to be an upsetting day.
Beneath the line of immaculate towering flags clad in wreaths, they filed past shop windows adorned in portraits. There were notices of bank holiday closures, whilst the queuing felt almost ritualised by the images of recent days. Then beneath the castle came another sweeping scene to define this day, amidst the many others on the screens before them. The Long Walk, spectacular backdrop to many of the Queen's state visits, now a hushed avenue of witnesses to her state funeral and its end.
This is a moment in history that will probably never be repeated. For many a time, certainly for a Queen. It's really hard to know how to sum up your feelings, because this is such a new experience for most of the nation.
I still can't believe that she's gone. Same as a lot of people, I don't think. People can't come to terms with it, I don't think. So, no, it's just very emotional.
You know, I spent my working life under the Crown. Wouldn't miss this for the world. Sad to see her go. End of an era, start of another one.
In the castle, so emblematic of era change in the House of Windsor, the chapel step-lining party took up position. And as the minute gun fired and the Sebastopol bell tolled, in the distance, the final procession began. Before the hearse, they watched the Grenadier Guards carry the Queen's company colour up towards the castle where she'd spent so much of her childhood. And as the procession swayed slowly towards the King George IV gate, there was a ripple of applause in its wake.
Totally amazing. Don't think we'll ever see anything like that again in our lifetime. Just absolutely amazing.
So glad we came. Pay our last respects.
Just so sad that it was the final goodbye.
I was happy that a lot of people came from all over the world to just witness her final goodbyes. And for me, that was, what can I say? It was very sad and emotional, but overwhelming at the same time.
I think what was nice about it was the fact that everyone just went silent as the coffin came past. It was just the silence, just a mark of respect. I think that really moved me.
As the hearse entered the castle grounds, to one side they brought the Queen's fell pony Emma, one of her favourites, it said. And when there was silence, it was arresting. And then into a chapel under whose tiles lie the remains of 3 centuries of monarchs, they carried the longest reigning of them all. There were 800 in St. George's Chapel, many of them members of the late Queen's household, past and present. And where the Queen once sat alone in the choir at her husband's funeral, now stood her son, the King. He listened as the same passage read at the Queen's father's funeral in 1952 was read again today.
I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea.
Surrounded by his family, the King would later place the Queen's company colour on her coffin, moments before it was lowered into the vault. The first female sovereign buried here, and for many, the last they'll ever know. As they sang God Save the King, outside, on the long walk, others joined in. For many, this day had been deeply affecting. Then, as dusk settled, quietly they began to head for home, some clearly thankful to have shared in the moment. whilst inside the castle, the royal family prepared for one final private service.